Abi has a particular passion or is particularly passionate about supporting healthy relationships for young people and also looking at the influence of pornography, which is why we could think of no better person to join us as our guest speaker today. So welcome, Abi.
So without good. Sorry, I was just going to say that was a very kind introduction. So thank you so much for that.
Well, we're really very pleased to have you with us. So I was actually going to ask you if there was anything you wanted to add in terms of your just introducing yourself a little bit more.
Okay, yeah, so I can do a bit of background. So obviously right now I'm the VOG coordinator for Oxfordshire County Council, but prior to this job, I was delivering relationships and sex education for young people through Brooke, and also professionals training, working one-to-one, doing group work, classroom sessions, assemblies, all sorts of different things. Before that, I did my master's in gender studies, and for my research there, I looked into the men who created babe channels, so that paid to participate TV kind of soft porn, and because I'd worked in the studios that produced them and before going to university. So I've kind of got an understanding of pornography in the industry from all sorts of different angles, the production, the impact on young people, what their understanding is, and then the impact of it on violence against women and girls as well.
Brilliant, thanks so much, Abi. Okay, so let's move into our first question. So, Abi, how are young people accessing pornography, and how can parents and carers manage that access? So this is often a question I think we get, especially if we did like a parent session with school.
So young people are accessing porn in all sorts of different ways. So sometimes they are accessing pornography by themselves. It may or may not be intentional. So I'll first cover the kind of routes to watching pornography in the first place. So sometimes, a lot of the time, young people will first see pornography not of their own volition. They might be shown it by a friend or an older sibling, or a friend's older sibling, somebody else in school. It might be a pop-up that comes up online for them. It might show up in targeted ads, not necessarily hardcore or mainstream porn, but routes into more intense kind of pornographic content can show up in ads. It can come up in all sorts of ways. Sometimes it can be an innocent search for something that you've heard about at school, and then that leads you to a pornography website. And a lot of the time, obviously, a lot of it's through digital technology. It's not like it was in, 70s and 80s where it was a magazine that was under someone's bed or a calendar in a garage. There's a lot of online content out there, very easily accessible via smartphone. And young people don't even necessarily have to go to like a mainstream porn site. There is so much porn on Twitter, and in terms of how can parents and carers manage that access, obviously there are some things that can be done, like parental controls on the Wi-Fi and phones and things like that, but it's not guaranteed to be successful, because even if they're not on your Wi-Fi or their phone, they'll inevitably at some point be on their own data or somebody else's phone, or in someone else's house with different parental controls. And it's like with the the conversations around how harmful social media is, you don't just keep your kids off social media forever, because that sidesteps the problem. It's all about rather than trying to protect them from it, which we can't really do, how do we arm them to be able to know what they're looking at and think critically about it.
Brilliant, thanks, Abi. And before we move on to the next question, I just wondered if you could speak a little bit on age. So do you know roughly like the average age that a young person is accessing pornography? I know obviously it will vary, but
ish. So it does vary massively between studies and which research you're looking at. So there was actually a recent report by the Children's Commissioner called "A Lot of It is Actually Just Abuse." Although I do take the data, they call something statistically significant when it's 2 percentage points. So read it with caution. But so they said that 1 in 10 young people will have seen pornography by the age of 9. 1 in 3 will have seen pornography by the age of 11, and 1 in 2 will have seen pornography by the age of 13. And that by the age of 18, 80% of young people have seen violent pornography. So we can't get, you know, we don't really get a sense of the youngest age anybody's seen it or the oldest, you know, and some young people won't ever watch pornography, and you know, but there's it, yeah, across all sorts of ages.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. And as you said, you know, even if someone wasn't actively searching out pornography, they might accidentally stumble upon something, because it's so widely accessible through platforms like Twitter, which is, when you told me that the first time, I was really, really surprised.
It's out there.
Yeah. So, as you said, maybe we can't necessarily manage it if young people are going to see it most probably at some point. So how can we empower young people and give them the tools to manage what they're seeing online and on their smartphones?
Okay, so I think there are like two aspects to this. So the first is that actually curiosity about sex and naked bodies a few years prior to becoming sexually active is really natural developmentally. That curiosity isn't a bad thing. And so part of what we can be doing, although I can understand that some parents and professionals might find it a bit uncomfortable, but is find other resources, find other things that we can share with them that age appropriately satiate their curiosity. So like it can be as simple as books about puberty or the facts of life, or it can be things like the vulva gallery, where there are illustrations of lots of different types of vulva, or the Great Wall of Vulva with plastic cast. I need to find like an equivalent for penises and testicles. But there are things out there where young people can get a sense of bodies and sexual relationships in a way that is appropriate for their age and development. And then I think the other aspect of this is about us being proactive in encouraging critical thinking skills in our young people, sharing information with them, learning ourselves a bit more about pornography and the kinds of things that they might be exposed to intentionally or not, so that we can have those important conversations with them that, you know, they provide them with some porn literacy, if you will.
Thanks, Abi. And just going slightly off-piste here, do you think that if a young person has had some fairly good sex education lessons in school, they are more likely to think critically when they're watching, if they're exposed to pornography at some point?
Yeah, so I would say that depends on how you define good quality RSE.
Yeah.
So if we look at the curriculum, obviously the curriculum talks about bodies, anatomy, infections, consent, and all of these things. But actually, there was some research by, I think her name's Esther McGeaney. She did a PhD when I worked at Brooke, and one of the most effective approaches to relationships and sex education is one that's based in pleasure, not risk. So if we have relationships and sex education, which highlights or emphasizes to young people, you know, regardless of what your values are, and your sexual values will be very aligned to your other values, but sex is supposed to be an enjoyable experience. It's supposed to be pleasurable. It's supposed to be about connection and intimacy and all of these different aspects. If we focus on the kind of sex that young people should be aiming to have at some point whenever they become sexually active, then that means that they'll be able to see the more extreme and violent pornography in a different way. Like, oh, that doesn't look very enjoyable, or that doesn't look very intimate. You know, they can bring a different lens to what they're seeing.
Yeah. So I guess feeding in sort of values around respect and consent and kindness and communication.
Absolutely.
And I guess that can be done not just in RSE, but across the board.
Totally. And at home.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. So moving on, what are the impacts of pornography on body image? So I feel like we could sit and talk about this all day, but what comes to your mind kind of
straight off?
Ask that question.
Okay, so first comes to mind is kind of so when I used to deliver sessions with young people, we would do the activities that we actually do in training, Dot. So what does porn teach us that bodies should look like? And they would highlight, you know, they're hairless, they're slim, they've got, you know, their skin is all the same color. So there's like genital bleaching and things like that. So young people definitely are seeing pornography and seeing what they think bodies are supposed to look like. But I would say as well that that's not isolated to pornography. That might be where it's the most kind of extreme, that you're seeing genitals where you're not necessarily seeing them elsewhere. But this kind of expectation of bodies is across all sorts of media. In terms of the research, what I find really interesting about the impact of pornography on body image is that it seems to have a more harmful impact on boys and young men's body image and self-esteem, more of an impact on them than it does on girls and young women. And you know what, there was a conversation about obviously this on the porn training that I delivered yesterday, and one of the men on there said, well, that seems quite natural, because in pornography, you know, you can't see the inside of a vagina, but you can see somebody's penis. And so you see a lot of genital embarrassment in boys and young men who watch a lot of porn. They might feel inadequate, that their penis isn't big enough, and all sorts of these things. And you do see as well both young men and young women removing their pubic hair from a really early age, because you don't see a lot of pubic hair or body hair in pornography. Yeah, so we look at, you know, porn stars don't look like natural people a lot of the time. Sometimes they do, but a lot of the time they don't. Yeah, and there's a lot of work that goes into the body maintenance of being on camera naked, you know, which is not the same as your day-to-day person's time investment, if you will.
Yeah. Do you know, it's fine if you don't have a statistic, but do you know roughly how many people who are working in the pornography industry have had like work done, maybe like cosmetic procedures?
No, do you know what? I don't know that statistic, but it's increasingly common. I mean, it's the same in all areas, isn't it? We're seeing more and more kind of cosmetic procedures. You know, people before they go on Love Island, you know, they'll have to spend hundreds of pounds on fillers and all sorts of stuff, and you know, breast augmentations. But no, I don't have a stat, but you know, and I think it's as well important not to kind of homogenize online pornography. So there is a lot of pornography that features women with loads of enhancements, and then there are areas of pornography where they've got more natural bodies. It depends what people are seeing. The issue is that a lot of the free to access pornography is predominantly the ones with enhancements or augmentations.
Yeah, and it's worth noting for our participants today that when we're talking about the influence of pornography, we are really focusing on the mainstream pornography industry. Just one more question from me before we move on to the next point. Do you think, so you said quite rightly that the pressures or the body image influences are more wide than just coming from pornography. We have them in coming from social media, marketing, advertising, etc. But do you think that pornography influences those, or do you think they all influence each other? I'm just trying to work out, like, do you think it all trickles down from pornography? Or
I don't think it starts with pornography at all. I think it's a social thing. You know, this hypervigilance about women's bodies, especially women's bodies. Boys and young men's bodies are coming into that conversation more and more, but this has been around for a long time, you know, and it's just kind of like snowballing in terms of how much money we have to spend to look a certain way and how much time we have to spend making sure we look a certain way. I will, for a bit of balance, if it's okay, also highlight that there is evidence of some positive impacts of pornography on body image as well. So especially where we've got like LGBT, so trans young people especially watching pornography, that can be really affirming for them to see somebody with a body like theirs at different stages of transition being desired and experiencing pleasure. And there's also some research as well that suggests that the girls and women who watch pornography are more comfortable nude. And they can be a bit happier with their own genitals, because girls and women don't tend to get to see other girls and women's genitals in the same way for the most part that boys and men do, like sharing changing rooms and urinals and things like that.
Yeah, that's true actually. Okay, cool, thank you. Okay, so moving on to the next question. What are the impacts of pornography on relationships? So let's go back to the mainstream pornography industry on the whole, but as you said, you know, there are positive impacts, particularly maybe in ethical pornography that we are seeing. So we're not talking across the board here.
Yeah, so I'll start with the positive impacts for this one. So there is some evidence that if people in relationships, I'm talking more about people of legal age to watch pornography here, but if people in relationships watch pornography together, that can actually have a positive impact on their relationship, their connection, their sexual satisfaction. You can explore things together. It can improve communication around sex, because even though sex is something that most people engage in, whether on their own or with other people, it's still something that's not really spoken about that much. And so watching pornography can be a way to open up those conversations with a partner. In terms of the potentially harmful impacts, there are quite a few. So, you know, there's research that shows that even watching porn just a few times a year makes you feel less satisfied with your partner's body and less satisfied with the sex that you're having. It prompts kind of unrealistic expectations of what sex is supposed to be like. So people in relationships can feel like they're expected to have sex in a particular way, and that isn't necessarily the sex that they want to be having. And it can interrupt the sense of safety in your relationship as well. So there's in mainstream pornography, there is lots of violence and lots of violent and aggressive sex in that. And one thing that's coming through quite clearly with young people is, and all people actually, is strangulation during sex. Now, if we're looking at relationships, strangulation is obviously a high risk indicator when it comes to domestic abuse, and yet that's something that seems to be increasingly commonplace in young people's sexual practices without any communication or any consideration of why is that actually something I like? What are the risks here? And it means as well that when we're assessing, when we're doing a dash with domestic abuse, that people may not recognize the question about strangulation and suffocation to be relevant because they see it as happening within the context of sex, rather than within the context of violence. But the context is irrelevant. Strangulation is strangulation, you know, and it does increase the risk of homicide further down the line.
Well, thank you, Abi. So moving on to our penultimate question. How can we feel confident to have conversations with young people about issues that relate to online content with real world impacts? So whether pornography or alpha male misogynistic influences, one maybe in particular that I'm sure we all have in our minds at the moment. But how can we feel confident to have those conversations with young people?
So I think in terms of building confidence, it's find out a bit more yourself. So come to things like this, join the OSCB training on pornography, read some articles. There are some really great places to go and look for further information like Bish and Brooke, you know, and there are some articles in The Guardian around, you know, strangulation during sex, the rise of misogynistic influences online. Just find out a little bit more so that you can feel a little bit more informed going into the conversations, because that does help, because then you can kind of like steer it in a particular way. And I think there's a lot of pressure on parents especially, but also professionals, to have like the talk, you know, to when we're having conversations about these things, it's a very intense kind of like one-off conversation. But the key is to have smaller, low pressure conversations in an ongoing way. So you don't have to be worried about having the conversation, because it's not like you're having the conversation. You're just having a little conversation about one thing in particular. So, you know, we can say, oh, I read an article that said this, or I heard so-and-so saying that this is going around at school. Have you heard about this? What do you think about this? And it's about having open and age-appropriate conversations as well. So to a point, being led by the young person that you're engaging with. What do they know? Where are they at developmentally? What's appropriate to bring into that conversation? And I think there can be the potential to respond with shock or outrage sometimes, especially to some of the misogynistic stuff that young people are hearing. But what's actually most effective with young people is remaining kind of calm and open-minded, even if our insides are like screaming at what we're hearing, you know, but trying to stay calm and just encourage critical thinking. Like, young people's brains are still developing. They've got, you know, loads of flexibility in their thinking, and it feels like our job as adults to help them to think a bit differently potentially about things. So if they're talking about particular, you know, online male influences, are there any more positive male role models that we can talk about? Or can we watch a TED talk together, you know, like Tony Porter's A Call to Men? And can we discuss that? It's, you know, it's not necessarily about that's, I mean, no, again, no matter how much you're inside saying that's awful, you can't think that, it's let's explore why you think that. Is there anything else that we can bring to this conversation? You know, and just help them to navigate it. So with the confidence, basically, long story short, I think it's about try and make sure that you feel a little bit informed, at least. Keep the pressure off it. You know, it's just short check-ins every now and then, and just remain open and encourage critical thinking skills.
Brilliant, thanks, Abi. I'm sure that's really helpful to people on the call. I think definitely that the idea of sort of drip feeding it, or like making these conversations more commonplace rather than it being one sit down session where you try and kind of cover it all, is a lot of pressure, like you said, on adults as well.
Sorry, one more thought, Dot, sorry. It's that you can talk about gender and relationships in all sorts of ways all of the time, you know. It's, you don't even have to necessarily be talking about the thing that you take issue with. You can be exploring gender in different places. Talk about, you know, how many police officers you see that are men and how many that are women, and, you know, talk about why that might be, you know, and we can start this really, really young.
Yeah, and I really loved your suggestion of it seems simple, but actually asking, what do you think about this, rather than coming in straight away with an opinion.
Yeah.
And just then unpicking their ideas or helping them to maybe see alternative viewpoints is really, I can imagine, helpful. Cool. Okay, so final question, and then we can open up the conversation. So what support is out there for young people and how do they get it?
So support around healthy relationships or porn addiction. So I'll go through a few different things, I suppose. So in terms of work around healthy relationships, so if a young person has been a victim of crime, so whether they've grown up with domestic abuse or all sorts of different things, they can then get support from SAFE, which is obviously a local charity, and they do healthy relationships work as part of their one-to-one work as well. But obviously there's a threshold for referral into that service. But there is, so support and information, like, you know, Brooke Young People, they've got loads of information there on sex, on relationships. They've even got a page on pornography. Bish, so BISH, like fish with a B. That is a young people's focused website. It's predominantly for ages 14 plus. But they've got really great articles on there that are young people friendly in terms of like how they read and what they interact with. If there are, and also there's books, so things like there's a yellow book called Sex Ed. It's got a banana on it. I can't remember who wrote it, sorry, but there are books out there that you can read yourself and then share with young people. Now, one of the issues with pornography is potentially moving into compulsive pornography use, which some people, including young people, can feel like they might have an issue with. So if a young person shares with you that they feel like a bit concerned about how much pornography they're using and they can't manage it themselves, they can access support via their GP in the first instance, and then the GP can refer them into, you know, potentially some like mental health support or harmful sexual behaviours. So, you know, we've got different things out there that they can link in with.
Brilliant, thank you. And am I right in saying there's a revenge porn helpline?
Yes, there is. I meant to mention that one. Sorry. Yes, there is a revenge porn helpline, and where revenge porn has been shared, so where images or videos have been shared, there's a function on the NSPCC website to remove a nude image as well. So you can get the image uploaded onto that, and then that will be automatically removed. They don't keep the image, they keep the coding, or I don't know the text speak, but they keep the details of the image, but not the image itself, and then can remove
really
it as
cool.
well.
That's really cool. I didn't know about that. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Abi. I know you've spoken quite a lot, so have a little breather for a moment. That was all really, really helpful. Tanya, did you want to turn the recording off so that we...
Ba-da-bum-bum-bum, ba-da-bum-bum, ba-da-bum-bum-bum.